When everything around you speaks of defeat, when the numbers are stacked against you, and when hope seems like a distant memory, what does it take to believe that the impossible is still within reach? The story begins in the shadows of despair. Israel, once a thriving nation led by the mighty hand of God, was now gasping under the weight of oppression. The Midianites were not just enemies, they were tormentors. Like a relentless swarm of locusts, they swept through the land, stealing crops, livestock, and any shred of peace the Israelites tried to hold on to. Each year, like clockwork, they came, and each year Israel's hope withered a little more. There was no safety in the cities, no shelter in the fields. Men threshed their wheat in secret places, women cried out in silence, and children grew up knowing hunger and fear instead of songs and celebration. It was a time of hiding, a time of survival, a time when even the boldest warriors began to question if God had turned his face away from them. This was not just a political crisis, it was a spiritual one. The people of Israel had wandered far from their covenant, trading the protection of the Almighty for the false promises of foreign gods. And with that rebellion came consequence, not vengeance, but discipline, not abandonment, but correction. The Midianite oppression was not without meaning. It was a mirror held up to a nation that had forgotten where its strength truly came from. Yet in the middle of this chaos, in the thick of this despair, something was stirring. Not in the palaces of kings or the halls of warriors, but in the quiet places, in the hearts of the broken, in the breath of prayers whispered in the dark. Israel began to cry out, not in empty ritual, but with genuine desperation. And when the cry of the people reached heaven, heaven responded. That is where every great shift begins, not with armies or strategies, but with a cry, a surrender, a moment when humanity admits its weakness and turns its gaze upward. Psalm 34 verse 17 says, "The righteous cry out, and the Lord hears them, he delivers them from all their troubles." This was one of those moments. In response, God did not send a legion of angels. He did not raise a general from among the elite. He chose an unexpected path, a man in hiding, a people broken, a plan that made no sense by human standards. This is the paradox of divine intervention. The Almighty often chooses the weakest to display his strength. He selects the least likely, the overlooked, and the afraid. Because in those vessels, there is room for glory to shine. And so, the story of Gideon unfolds, not as a tale of heroic conquest, but as a masterclass in faith, obedience, and divine timing. It's a story not just about the past, but about every present moment where someone faces a mountain too high, a battle too fierce, or odds too overwhelming. Gideon's victory is more than history. It is a blueprint, a reminder that the impossible is never final when the hand of God is at work. Before a single sword is drawn, before a single trumpet sounds, the foundation is laid in the unseen realm, in the hearts of those who dare to believe when belief feels ridiculous. That is where the real battle begins. And in that foundation, we find the essence of this story. Not just a fight against Midian, but a revelation about how God moves. He does not operate by majority. He does not need favorable odds. He does not require human logic to validate divine will. In fact, the more unlikely the scenario, the more evident his power becomes. As we enter this story, do not rush past the despair. Do not gloss over the fear or the confusion. Sit with it. Feel what Israel felt. See the weight of the oppression, the silence in the streets, the tremble in every voice. Because only when you understand the depth of the valley can you appreciate the miracle of the climb. Every miracle begins with a problem. Every deliverance starts with bondage, and every Gideon moment begins in weakness. This is not just Gideon's story. It is the story of every person who has ever felt outnumbered, unqualified, or unseen. It is the story of what happens when heaven interrupts history with a whisper that becomes a roar. You are standing at the edge of one of the most astonishing accounts in all of Scripture, a moment when 300 men stood against thousands and walked away victorious, not because of their skill, their strength, or their strategy, but because God made a decision to use the improbable for the incredible. It is difficult to imagine a more unremarkable beginning for a leader of a nation than the moment we meet Gideon. He is not standing tall before an army or surrounded by loyal followers. He is not giving orders or preparing for battle. When the narrative first introduces him, Gideon is hiding, pressed low in a winepress, not to crush grapes, but to thresh wheat in secret. The symbolism is unavoidable. A place designed for the harvest of fruit is being used to preserve grain, and a man who should be strong and bold is crouched in fear, trying not to be seen. This image encapsulates everything that Gideon represents at the start. He is not the obvious choice. He's not confident, not influential, not courageous by outward appearance. He is doing what he can to survive, not thrive. He is, in many ways, the embodiment of a broken people, resigned, afraid, and simply trying to hold on to the little he has left. Every motion he makes in that winepress is marked by caution, every sound hushed by the threat of Midianite retaliation. It is not just wheat he is hiding, it is also his identity, his strength, and perhaps even his hope. And yet, it is precisely in this setting, in this moment of concealment and fear, that the angel of the Lord appears to him. The words spoken are startling, not because they are dramatic, but because they seem so utterly disconnected from reality. "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Mighty warrior, these two words do not match the man before us. There are no visible signs of might. There is no battlefield, no shining armor, no air of leadership, just a man in hiding, startled by a divine greeting that feels more like mockery than affirmation. But this is the beauty and tension of divine calling. God does not speak to who we are in the moment. He speaks to who we are becoming. He addresses Gideon not as he sees himself, but as he is seen through the eyes of heaven. The title, Mighty Warrior, is not a statement about Gideon's current condition, but a prophetic declaration about his destiny. And this distinction is crucial, not only for understanding Gideon's transformation, but for grasping how God works with us. Divine calling is never based on what is visible. It is rooted in eternal vision. Gideon's response reveals his internal struggle. He does not embrace the title with gratitude or humility. He questions it, he challenges it, he offers his credentials, or more precisely, his lack of them. He reminds the divine messenger that his clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and he is the least in his family. In today's language, he's saying, "You have the wrong guy." But this protest only reinforces why Gideon was chosen. God was not searching for the strongest family, the largest tribe, or the most qualified individual. He was looking for someone who could be shaped, someone who was empty enough to be filled with divine strength. It is easy to look at ourselves and count the reasons why we cannot be used. Our past mistakes, our limited abilities, our social status, our fears, they all scream disqualification. And yet, in the economy of heaven, these very limitations become the canvas for God's power. Gideon was not chosen in spite of his weaknesses, but because of them. His fear became the starting point for faith. His doubt became the soil where trust would grow, and his hiding place became the setting for transformation. We often underestimate the power of availability. While Gideon did not volunteer himself for greatness, he did not run when the call came. He stayed in the conversation. He questioned, he wrestled, but he did not walk away. That persistence, that willingness to stay present even in confusion, is what made him usable. God can do extraordinary things through those who are simply willing to show up, even if they show up with trembling hands. And there is another layer to consider. Gideon was not just hiding from the Midianites, he was hiding from what he feared about himself. He was suppressing the possibility that there might be more to his life than survival. When God called him, he was not only rescuing a nation, he was awakening a man to his true identity. This is a reminder that divine assignments are rarely about the task alone. They are about the transformation of the person carrying it. Gideon would deliver Israel, yes, but in doing so, he would also discover who he truly was. This theme echoes through countless stories in Scripture. Moses protested his speech. Jeremiah complained of his youth. David was overlooked by his own father. Yet each of these was called not because they were ready, but because they were willing. Gideon joins this chorus of unlikely heroes whose qualifications were not found in their resumes, but in their response. In many ways, Gideon is not just a character in an ancient story. He is a mirror. He reflects the insecurities that still plague people today, the voice that says, "You are not enough," the fear that whispers you will fail, the belief that someone else is more capable, more worthy, more fit for the task. But the same voice that called Gideon out of hiding calls to every person who feels unseen. It says, "You are more than your fear. You are more than your background. You are more than what others have said about you." The journey from hiding to leading is not instantaneous. It is not paved with confidence or certainty. It begins with a whisper in the shadows, with a name spoken over you that feels too big to carry. But if you stay in the conversation, if you keep showing up, God will shape you into the very thing He has already called you. Gideon did not become a mighty warrior the moment those words were spoken, but the moment they were spoken, something shifted. Heaven had declared it, and now every step of his journey would be a movement toward that truth. The moment of Gideon's divine encounter unfolds not on a mountain, not in a sanctuary, and not in the middle of some ceremonial spectacle. It happens in a place that could not be more ordinary, a winepress, a space meant for pressing grapes, repurposed for hiding grain, and now, unexpectedly, the sacred stage for a meeting between heaven and earth. There is something profoundly intentional in this choice of setting. It is as if God was making a statement without speaking a word, that He does not wait for the perfect place to deliver purpose, but instead enters the hidden corners of human life to awaken what lies dormant. The angel of the Lord does not simply appear to give instructions. The tone of this visitation is deeply personal, intimate even. It is not a royal decree from a distance, but a close and direct address, as if heaven had stooped down to the level of Gideon's fear just to lift him out of it. What makes this moment so striking is not just the content of the message, but the way it touches the most vulnerable places in Gideon's heart. When Gideon questions the presence of God by pointing to the suffering of his people. If the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? It is not just a logical inquiry. It is the outcry of a soul that has watched too much go wrong for too long. The angel does not engage in a theological debate. He does not explain the intricacies of Israel's disobedience or offer a long discourse on covenant consequences. Instead, he redirects the conversation with purpose. Go in the strength you have. There is no breakdown of strategy, no list of guaranteed outcomes, only a call to move forward with what Gideon already possesses. This response is both simple and profound because it redefines strength not as a measurable quantity, but as a willingness to obey despite fear. Still, even with this divine commission, Gideon hesitates. His heart is not yet fully anchored in belief, and this too is something God honors. Gideon asks for a sign, not out of arrogance, but out of genuine uncertainty. He is not trying to test God. He is trying to be sure that he is not mistaking his own thoughts for a divine directive. And what follows is more than a sign. It is a sacred moment wrapped in ritual and fire. Gideon prepares an offering, not in a temple or before a priest, but in the raw, open space where he first met the messenger. A young goat, unleavened bread and broth, the very resources he would have needed to survive, are presented not as a sacrifice of leftovers, but as a gift of trust. This was not a ceremonial act, it was a costly one. In a time of scarcity, to give away food was not symbolic, it was sacrificial. And that is where the offering gains its meaning. Faith does not always require grand gestures, but it always requires something costly. The angel instructs Gideon to place the meat and bread on a rock and pour the broth over it. Then, with the touch of a staff, fire springs up from the stone and consumes it all. There is no loud voice from heaven, no angelic choir, no thunder from above, just fire. But in that fire is confirmation. In that consuming flame is the assurance Gideon had longed for. What he offered in trust was accepted in power. This moment changes everything, not because Gideon is now suddenly brave, but because the abstract idea of God's presence has become real. No longer is God just the subject of his ancestors' stories. No longer is he only the deity of past deliverance. Now he is present, now he is personal, now he has touched Gideon's offering with fire, and nothing will ever be the same. Gideon's reaction is telling. The sudden realization that he has seen the angel of the Lord face to face overwhelms him with fear. He assumes death is near. This is consistent with ancient beliefs that to see God was to perish. Yet instead of death, Gideon receives peace. The Lord speaks directly again, not through signs but through words. Peace, do not be afraid. You are not going to die. In this statement we find not only comfort but covenant. God is not merely calming Gideon's nerves, he is affirming his place in the story that is about to unfold. From this moment, a shift occurs. Gideon builds an altar and names it, "The Lord is Peace." Not "The Lord is Power," though power had just been displayed. Not "The Lord is Fire," though fire had just descended. He names it for the peace that followed revelation. Because when God reveals himself, what remains after the fire is not fear, but peace. This chapter of Gideon's life reminds us that divine purpose is always born from divine presence. God does not send Gideon into battle with mere inspiration. He sends him forward with confirmation. The signs, the offering, the fire, all serve as evidence that Gideon is not moving alone. And in that, there is a profound truth for anyone facing uncertainty. That obedience is not a leap into darkness, but a step guided by light, even if that light is just enough for 1 foot at a time. God's presence does not always arrive in thunder or spectacle. Sometimes it appears in the middle of a hidden place, in a voice that calls us mighty when we feel anything but. Sometimes it consumes what we offer and replaces it with peace. Sometimes it comes not to change our circumstances right away, but to change our understanding of who we are and who walks with us. For Gideon, this encounter was not the climax of his story, but the beginning of transformation. What started as fear in a winepress would now become faith forged in fire. And that fire, quiet and consuming, would burn not just through the offering, but through every doubt that once kept him hidden. Before a single step is taken toward the battlefield, before Gideon ever lays eyes on the Midianite camp, and long before a trumpet sounds in the hands of his chosen 300, a far more personal and private mission is entrusted to him. It is not a military task or a strategic preparation. It is a spiritual confrontation that strikes at the very heart of his family, his community, and even his own upbringing. The command is clear, unmistakable, and deeply uncomfortable. Destroy the altar of Baal and cut down the Asherah pole standing beside it. These were not just random objects, they were central to the spiritual corruption that had taken root in Israel. More than mere statues or symbols, they represented a system of misplaced devotion, inherited compromise, and cultural surrender to pagan practices. What makes this act so challenging is not simply the religious implications, but the relational ones. This altar did not belong to a distant enemy or a foreign land. It stood in Gideon's own backyard. It was part of his father's household, embedded in the fabric of his family's traditions, and accepted without protest by the people around him. This is where many are tempted to hesitate. It is one thing to oppose the sins of strangers. It is quite another to confront what has been normalized within your own walls. Gideon is not being asked to fight an external enemy yet. He is being called to confront internal disorder. And this task, though lacking the glamour of battle or the thrill of conquest, may be the most difficult one he will face. Because before he can lead others into obedience, he must first walk that road himself. Before he can break the grip of fear on a nation, he must shatter the compromise that exists in his own house. There is a spiritual principle at work here that echoes across time. True leadership in the kingdom of God is never about public performance. It begins in private obedience. The call to tear down altars is not a call to violence, but to purity. It is a demand that the space of influence be cleared of anything that competes with the presence and authority of God. These altars to Baal were not just religious missteps. They were symptoms of a deeper sickness, a people who had forgotten who their true deliverer was, who had traded the living God for the convenience of cultural acceptance. Gideon obeys, but his approach reveals the weight of the task. He does not carry it out in broad daylight. He takes 10 servants with him and waits until nightfall. This is not cowardice. It is the tension of a man caught between the call of God and the pressure of his community. He knows the backlash will be fierce. He understands that confronting what others have embraced, especially when it has gone unchallenged for so long, will not be met with applause. And yet, he acts. Even in the dark, even in fear, he moves forward. Because obedience, even hesitant obedience, is still obedience. What happens next is predictable and yet deeply revealing. When the townspeople wake and discover the altar destroyed and the Asherah pole cut down, their response is not repentance, it is rage. They demand to know who is responsible, and when they find out it was Gideon, they call for his death. This is the unsettling truth about idols. They often hold more power over people's hearts than truth itself. When idols are challenged, they do not go quietly. They provoke defense, denial, and in many cases, retaliation. Because tearing down an altar is never just a physical act. It is a spiritual declaration that the old way must die. But in the midst of this hostility, something unexpected happens. Joash, Gideon's father, steps forward, not to join the mob, but to protect his son. His words are simple, yet profound. If Baal really is a god, he can defend himself. In this moment, Joash shifts from passive participant in idolatry to an unlikely defender of truth. Perhaps Gideon's courage stirred something in him. Perhaps seeing his son take a stand caused him to reconsider the years of silent complicity. Whatever the reason, Joash does not allow the crowd to touch Gideon, and with that, the tide begins to turn. This chapter in Gideon's story offers a sobering insight into the cost of spiritual leadership. It does not begin on a stage or a battlefield. It begins with a confrontation of personal compromise. God was not interested in using a man who was simply strategic. He was looking for a man who was clean. Before Gideon could lead Israel to tear down Midianite strongholds, he had to prove that he would tear down the strongholds within his own household. In every generation, this pattern repeats. Leaders who are truly effective in the spiritual realm are not those who speak well, strategize brilliantly, or rally crowds. They are those who have first confronted and destroyed the altars in their own lives. Not just the obvious sins, but the subtle dependencies. The trust in status, the craving for control, the fear of people's opinions, the silent acceptance of cultural idols that blend in so easily with faith until they become nearly indistinguishable. Modern idols may not always look like carved statues or wooden poles, but they still demand loyalty. They still consume attention, shape identity. They come in the form of ambition that edges God out, relationships that override obedience, comfort that dulls conviction, and systems of thought that distort truth. And like Gideon's mission, removing them often begins with personal cost, often in private, often misunderstood by those closest to us. But it must begin there, because until the inner altars are torn down, the outer battles remain unwinnable. Gideon's act of destruction was, in reality, an act of dedication. He was removing what did not belong to make room for what truly mattered. And in doing so, he was not just obeying a command, he was being prepared. Prepared to carry the weight of leadership, prepared to bear the burden of deliverance, and prepared to act as a vessel through which God's authority could flow without obstruction. This is where the real proving ground of leadership lies, not in what is seen, but in what is surrendered, not in what we build, but in what we are willing to destroy when it competes with God's rule. Gideon's first victory was not against Midian, it was against compromise. And without that victory, no other battle could be won. At first glance, Gideon's progress seems encouraging. The altar of Baal has been destroyed. His reputation has begun to shift from that of a fearful man to a potential deliverer, and he has blown the trumpet to summon the tribes of Israel. The call has gone out, and remarkably the response is massive. From a man who once hid in a winepress, Gideon now stands before an army of 32,000 men. In a time of uncertainty and danger, this number must have seemed like an answer to prayer. Strength, finally, could be counted. Reinforcements were no longer a wish, but a reality. The nation was ready to push back against the Midianite oppression with an army that had substance, volume, and presence. And then, unexpectedly, God speaks again, not with encouragement about the large force or praise for Gideon's newfound influence, but with a command that feels entirely counterintuitive. The army is too big, not too small, not too weak, too big. This declaration stands in sharp contrast to every instinct a military leader would have. Human wisdom says the more soldiers, the better the chances. Numbers mean security, strategy, and success. But God's reasoning cuts through the conventional. You have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me, saying, "My own strength has saved me." What unfolds next is not a military maneuver. It is a theological refinement. God is not preparing for a typical battle. He is preparing for a demonstration of trust. The first instruction is simple, though its implications are profound. Tell the fearful to go home. No pressure, no shame. Just an open door for anyone who trembles at the thought of war. And the result is staggering. Of the 32,000 men, 22,000 walk away. 2/3 of the army vanish in a moment, not because they were disloyal, but because they were honest about their fear. Fear, in this context, is more than a human emotion. It is a spiritual contaminant. It spreads silently, invisibly, undermining resolve before the battle ever begins. God, in His mercy, removes the fearful not to shame them, but to protect the mission. He understands what Gideon might not yet grasp, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to stand despite it. But there is a kind of fear that erodes trust, that whispers louder than faith, and that would have fractured the resolve of the army before the first trumpet sounded. Still, even with the number reduced to 10,000, God is not finished. The army is still too large. Once again, Gideon receives an instruction that defies all logic. This time, he is to take the men down to the water, where they will be tested in a way that seems, at first, arbitrary. God watches how the men drink. Some kneel and drink directly with their mouths, while others cup water in their hands and lap it like dogs. From this seemingly insignificant behavior, a divine selection is made. Only the 300 who drank with cupped hands are chosen to remain. There is no indication that these men were stronger, smarter, or more disciplined than the others. The test was not one of skill, but of posture. Some have speculated that those who lapped from their hands were more alert, keeping their eyes on the horizon even as they drank, while others submerged themselves in their thirst, unaware of their surroundings. Whether or not this interpretation holds, the result is clear. God wanted fewer, not more. Dependence, not dominance. Obedience, not optics. What is happening here is more than reduction. It is purification. God is stripping away every crutch, every fallback, every reason for Israel to claim credit for the victory that is coming. This is the fear factor at its core. Not just the fear within the soldiers, but the fear of what happens when control is surrendered, when the visible support systems are taken away, and all that remains is the invisible promise of God. The narrowing of the army is a divine confrontation with humanity's obsession with numbers. It exposes how easily we place our trust in what we can count, measure, and quantify. Strength in the eyes of most is always calculated by size, but in the hands of God, strength is measured by surrender. The more dependent the vessel, the more room there is for divine power to operate without interference. This moment in Gideon's story forces us to confront the question of where we place our confidence. When the crowd thins, when resources dwindle, when support systems disappear, do we panic, or do we remember the God who called us in the first place? Gideon does not protest. He does not argue with the numbers. He does not try to hold on to the 10,000. He releases them, trusting that the same voice that met him in the winepress is still directing him by the water's edge. And here lies the deeper truth. God is not interested in proving Gideon's capability. He is interested in displaying his own. The pruning of the army is not a detour. It is the plan, because the victory ahead must be unmistakably divine. It must carry no fingerprints but God's. The only explanation allowed will be that the impossible happened because the Almighty intervened. Faith, then, is not merely believing that God can act. It is being willing to walk into the impossible when every logical structure has been removed. It is trusting that the same God who reduced your army to a fraction is the same God who will magnify your impact beyond reason. And that kind of faith is never developed in abundance. It is forged in scarcity. It is shaped in the silence between the subtraction and the miracle. The shrinking of Gideon's army is not a loss. It is a preparation. It is the dismantling of false confidence so that true confidence can rise, not in weapons, not in warriors, but in the one who commands both. And as the dust settles and only 300 remain, the stage is not diminished. It is refined, the spotlight is sharpened, and what will happen next will forever silence the argument that victory belongs to the strong. Obedience in the biblical narrative is never presented as mere compliance or blind submission. It is the defining trait of those who walk with God. It is the proof of trust, the outworking of faith, and the path through which divine strategy unfolds. In Gideon's case, obedience becomes not only his response to God's direction, but the very mechanism by which the impossible begins to take shape. What sets Gideon apart in this moment is not his experience, nor his bravery, nor even his leadership skills. It is his willingness to follow divine instructions without deviation, even when those instructions appear completely irrational by human standards. Once the army is reduced to 300 men, the question shifts from "can we win" to "how do we proceed?" The size of the force has eliminated any illusion of conventional victory. There is no reasonable battle plan that could justify confidence in human terms. But this is exactly where obedience begins to shine, not as a response to what makes sense, but as a surrender to what has been revealed. Gideon does not propose alternatives. He does not negotiate better odds or ask for reinforcements. Instead, he receives and implements the plan exactly as it is given. and the plan, by all earthly accounts, is absurd. No swords, no shields, no armor formations. Instead, God directs Gideon to prepare each man with 3 seemingly unrelated items: a trumpet, a clay jar, and a torch hidden inside the jar. These are not weapons of war. They are instruments of noise, concealment, and light. Yet each element carries profound significance, and their combination is neither random nor decorative. It is, in fact, a strategic layering of divine intent meant to confuse the enemy and highlight the role of obedience in unlocking victory. The trumpet, in ancient warfare, was not only a call to arms, but a signal of authority. It represented presence, coordination, and leadership. For each of the 300 to hold one was an act of deception, an auditory illusion designed to make the Midianites believe they were surrounded by a massive, organized force. The sound would not merely be heard, it would echo through the valley, magnified by fear and disorientation. The jar, by contrast, concealed the torch. It represented potential hidden from view, a light restrained until the appointed time. The torch, though unseen at first, would later break forth, symbolizing sudden revelation and the uncontainable force of God's deliverance. What binds these elements together is Gideon's exact obedience. He does not alter the instructions or attempt to add his own flair. He prepares the men with precision, distributing the items as directed and assigning their roles with unwavering commitment to the divine pattern. Obedience here is not passive. It is active, detailed, and intentional. And this is what separates a moment of inspiration from a move of God. Faith may inspire the heart, but obedience puts hands and feet to that inspiration and walks it forward without compromise. In Gideon's actions, we see the quiet strength of a leader who no longer depends on numbers or natural advantage. His confidence now rests solely in the one who speaks. Every step he takes reflects the truth that divine outcomes require divine methods, and divine methods often appear foolish to the natural mind. But foolishness in the eyes of man becomes wisdom in the hands of God when it is rooted in obedience. This obedience also reorients the structure of authority. Gideon does not act as a sovereign commander, devising plans and issuing commands from his own intellect. He becomes a steward of God's instruction, an executor of a will not his own. And this is precisely what makes him effective. He does not dilute the message, nor does he hesitate when the path diverges from what is logical. Instead, he becomes a vessel through which God's precise will is enacted on the earth. The act of obedience, then, is not merely functional, it is transformative. It turns 300 men with unconventional items into instruments of divine disruption. It creates a moment in history where victory is no longer attributed to skill, strength, or numbers, but to the exactness of following what God has spoken. And in doing so, it sets a precedent for every believer who wrestles with the tension between what God says and what makes sense. Obedience, especially in situations where clarity seems elusive, becomes the compass that aligns human action with divine will. It does not demand full understanding, it requires full surrender. It does not wait for consensus or external validation. It acts on the confidence that the voice of God is enough. And in Gideon's case, this obedience does not just lead to personal breakthrough, it prepares the ground for national transformation. What we learn from this chapter of the story is that saying yes to God is not a momentary decision, it is a discipline. It is repeated in small details, confirmed in the quiet preparation, and honored in the hidden places long before the results are seen. Gideon's yes was not spectacular, it was steady. It was careful. It was rooted in reverence for the one who had called him out of hiding and who now asked him to lead without the safety net of human strategy. This is where the true power of obedience lies, not in what it achieves, but in what it releases. Because when God's instructions are followed with precision, they unlock outcomes no amount of planning or effort could ever produce. And what begins with jars and torches soon becomes a story remembered for generations, a testimony not to the greatness of Gideon, but to the supremacy of obedience in the face of overwhelming odds. In the stillness of night, when darkness cloaked the hills and valleys, and the enemy lay deeply entrenched in false security, Gideon and his 300 prepared to unleash a strategy that defied every known rule of warfare. No swords would be drawn, no arrows loosed. Instead, the victory would come through a convergence of sound, light, and calculated confusion, a divine orchestration designed not to overpower but to unravel. This moment was the culmination of everything that had come before, the tearing down of altars, the refining of the army, and the unwavering obedience to each instruction. Now, it was time to see what God would do through the unconventional. The strategy, though simple in design, carried layers of divine brilliance. The men were divided into 3 companies, each holding 3 items: a trumpet in one hand, a torch in the other, and a jar covering the flame until the precise moment. What might have seemed like an odd collection of props was, in reality, a weaponized display of psychological warfare. These 3 tools, when released in harmony, would trigger a level of chaos the Midianites could neither anticipate nor withstand. The timing of the attack was critical. The chosen moment was the beginning of the middle watch, just after the changing of the guards, when the camp was most vulnerable. Some soldiers would be half awake, others just settling into sleep, and the brief window of disorientation would prove decisive. Gideon, having already overheard a prophetic dream in the Midianite camp that foretold their defeat, now moved with confidence, not in numbers, but in the certainty that the Lord had gone ahead of him. As the signal was given, the night air erupted, not with the clash of steel, but with the piercing blast of trumpets. All 300 sounded their instruments at once, shattering the silence and jolting the enemy from slumber. Immediately following the noise came the breaking of the jars, a sudden crack of clay shattering against rock, revealing 300 blazing torches that seemed to encircle the camp. To the disoriented Midianites, it must have appeared that they were surrounded by a massive, organized force. Each torch likely represented in their minds an entire company of warriors. The visual illusion, combined with the overwhelming sound, created a perception of total encirclement. Then came the unified cry, "A sword for the Lord!" The voice of 300 shouted not for themselves, but in the name of their God and the leader he had chosen. This was not just a declaration, it was an invocation. It filled the darkness with the sound of identity, turning fear into a weapon and aligning every psychological factor against the enemy. The Midianites, already startled and confused, now descended into full-blown panic. What unfolded next was not a conventional battle, but a collapse of order. The enemy turned on itself in the frenzy. In the dark, unable to distinguish friend from foe, they struck one another in fear. Swords, meant for Israelites, found their mark in fellow Midianites. Campfires became places of bloodshed, and what was once an army became a stampede of terror. The Israelites did not have to lift a blade. God had turned the enemy's own hand against itself. This method of victory was not simply creative, it was prophetic. It demonstrated that God does not need strength in the traditional sense to achieve his purposes. He does not require superior tactics or firepower. He needs obedience, timing, and instruments willing to be used. The battle was not won by might or by power, but by the Spirit of the Lord directing every step of the process. The strange instructions, blow a trumpet, break a jar, hold up a torch, only made sense in hindsight and only worked because they were followed exactly. There is also a powerful lesson here about perception. The Midianites were not defeated by force, they were defeated by fear. What they believed was happening became more powerful than what was actually happening. The illusion of being surrounded by thousands caused them to act irrationally, to run without resistance, to destroy one another in confusion. This is the essence of psychological warfare. To exploit uncertainty, to amplify doubt, and to manipulate perception until the enemy collapses under its own assumptions. Gideon's victory at midnight is a reminder that the most effective strategies are not always visible to the human eye. Sometimes the breakthrough comes not through frontal assault, but through divine disruption. Sometimes the walls fall not because we pushed harder, but because we obeyed more precisely. Sometimes the loudest shout in the darkness is not a cry of war, but a declaration of faith that stirs heaven to move. This moment also serves as a counter-narrative to the idea that victory must be earned through grinding struggle. Gideon and his men did not win by exhausting themselves in prolonged combat. They won by surrendering the method of victory to God. Their role was not to create the outcome, but to carry out the instruction, and in doing so, they became participants in a miracle that bore the signature of divine intervention from every angle. The power of this midnight strategy lies not just in its result, but in its structure. It was impossible to replicate without God. No army could take this tactic and apply it with guaranteed success. It was a one-time, heaven-authored plan tailored to a specific moment, designed to make it unmistakable who the true commander was. That is the nature of God's intervention. It is never generic, never mechanical, always personal and intentional. As the dust settled and the enemy fled, the Israelites must have stood in stunned silence. There was no blood on their hands, no battle wounds, no casualties among their 300. What they had just witnessed was not a triumph of warriors, but a revelation of sovereignty. The torches burned, the trumpets still echoed, and the broken jars lay scattered across the hills, but the victory had already been written in the silence before the shout. And so, in a single night, a superpower collapsed, not because its enemies were stronger, but because they were obedient, not because they fought harder, but because they listened better. And that, in the economy of heaven, is where the greatest victories are always won. When the echo of trumpets faded and the flicker of torches began to dim beneath the breaking dawn, the battlefield told a story that no amount of military theory could explain. There were no siege engines, no casualties among the 300, no decisive clash of armies, yet the Midianite coalition had collapsed into itself and scattered in terrified retreat. The ground bore the marks of chaos, not conquest, and it was evident to anyone who saw it that this was not a victory forged by human hands. It was a divine interruption in the flow of history, a moment designed so deliberately and so impossibly that it defied every rational explanation. This was precisely the point. God had structured the entire event in such a way that any attempt to attribute the outcome to human brilliance would fall flat. There was no charismatic warrior to praise, no superior technology to applaud, no statistical advantage to marvel at. The story, from its earliest tremble in a wine press to the resounding confusion in the enemy camp, had always been a stage set for one purpose: to make it unmistakably clear that the glory belonged to God alone. Gideon, having witnessed the extraordinary unfold before him, now stood in the most dangerous place any servant of God can find themselves, not on the battlefield, but in the aftermath of success. The risk was no longer death or defeat. It was pride. It was the subtle, creeping temptation to claim ownership of a miracle, to allow admiration from others to evolve into self-exaltation. History is filled with men who handled adversity well, but stumbled in their handling of glory. And now the question turned not on Gideon's ability to lead, but on his willingness to remain small in the shadow of divine greatness. To his credit, Gideon's first responses suggest humility. He does not immediately demand status, does not carve his name into stone, does not attempt to write his own legend. Instead, he continues to pursue the remnants of the Midianite army, refusing to let the victory be only symbolic. He understands that deliverance must be completed, not just initiated. But even in this pursuit, there remains a test, not of strategy, but of the soul. The pressure to sustain what God had started, the allure of being seen as the savior of Israel, the whispers of the people suggesting he become their king, all of it presented a moment where motives would be revealed. What God had orchestrated could not be repackaged as human achievement without distorting the very nature of the deliverance. To do so would not just be a misrepresentation, it would be a betrayal of the lesson embedded in the process. From the reduction of the army to the strangeness of the battle plan, every step had been calibrated to ensure that no flesh could boast. This was not just about defeating Midian. It was about demonstrating that only God could have authored the victory, that only his presence could have shattered a superpower without a single sword. The people, inspired by what they had seen, approached Gideon with the offer of kingship, not just for him, but for his lineage. "Rule over us," they said, "you, your son and your grandson, because you have saved us." And here, in this one sentence, the danger becomes clear. The credit is misplaced. The glory is being redirected. Gideon's answer in this moment is one of spiritual clarity. He responds not with ambition, but with reverence. "I will not rule over you," he says, "nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." These words are more than modesty. They are a realignment of perspective. Gideon knows that to accept the throne would be to rewrite the story. It would shift the focus from the God who called him in hiding to the man who stood in victory. And while leadership is not inherently corrupt, Gideon recognizes that the throne offered to him was not grounded in covenant, but in gratitude distorted by awe. To accept it would have blurred the line between the vessel and the source, between the trumpet and the voice that filled it. The danger, however, does not end with a single decision. Even in his refusal to rule, Gideon makes a request that reveals the subtle influence of triumph. He asks for the earrings collected from the plunder, and from this gold he fashions an ephod, an item associated with priestly guidance. Though perhaps intended as a symbol of remembrance, the ephod becomes something else entirely. It draws the people's attention, becomes an object of reverence, and eventually a snare. The line between memory and idolatry is thin, and without vigilance, symbols can become substitutes for the presence they were meant to honor. This tension in Gideon's story reminds us that giving God the glory is not a single act. It is a continual posture. It is a continual posture. It is not merely rejecting titles or turning down crowns. It is about guarding the heart, resisting the drift towards self-centered legacy, and keeping the focus anchored where it belongs. The battle may have been won without effort, but the aftermath requires discipline, discernment, and humility. Because what we do with success speaks just as loudly as what we do with struggle. For those looking at their own lives, this chapter holds an invitation to reflection. We are often quick to recognize God in the crisis, but once breakthrough comes, once the tide turns and peace replaces pressure, it becomes easy to let our narrative shift. We begin to recount our efforts, our endurance, our wisdom in weathering the storm. Yet if we are honest, the path to victory, especially in the most miraculous moments, was paved not with our competence, but with His grace. It was His strength in our weakness, His voice in our silence, His fire in our offering. God ensures His hand is visible not to seek applause, but to strengthen faith. Every time He moves in ways we cannot explain, He is writing reminders into our story. Reminders that He is still the God who calls the unlikely, reduces the odds, commands the impossible, and delivers without explanation. He does it so we remember. So we do not try to rewrite the credit or manufacture our own glory, because when He is rightly exalted, we are rightly grounded. And in that balance, we find not only victory, but rest. The true miracle of Gideon's battle was not just in the way it was won, but in the message it carried, that God doesn't share his glory, not because he is insecure, but because he alone is worthy. When he moves, it is not to build our name, but to draw our eyes. And when we respond by keeping our hands off the credit, we create space for his presence to dwell among us, not just in the battle, but long after the trumpets fall silent. The arc of Gideon's life, which began with trembling uncertainty and rose to miraculous triumph, does not end on the high note we might expect. After the victory, after the pursuit of the remaining Midianite kings, and after the echoes of trumpets had long faded from the hills, Gideon returns to his people as a man transformed by divine partnership. Yet this transformation, so powerful in its earlier stages, begins to drift into a different kind of complexity. The danger that once came from outside, the Midianites, the doubt, the impossible odds, now begins to arise from within. And in this quiet, post-victory season, we see that the greater threat to Gideon's legacy is not defeat on the battlefield, but subtle compromise in the heart. The people, still reeling with amazement at what they had witnessed, naturally turned to Gideon with an offer that reveals both admiration and misunderstanding. "Rule over us," they say, "you, your son, and your grandson." It is a generational invitation, a desire to establish a human monarchy rooted not in divine command, but in emotional gratitude. They are ready to elevate Gideon from judge to king, to turn a spiritual deliverer into a political ruler. And to his credit, Gideon initially refuses. He reminds the people of a critical truth: the Lord will rule over you. His words are noble, his posture appears humble, and for a moment it seems that he has passed the test of success with the same faithfulness he showed in the face of fear. But something begins to shift, not overtly, not in defiance, but in direction. Gideon, though he refuses the title of king, makes a request that carries the weight of monarchy in disguise. He asks for the earrings collected from the plunder of battle, gold ornaments that once adorned the defeated enemy. From this gold, he creates an ephod, a priestly garment not meant for himself, but which soon becomes a focal point of attention and reverence among the people. What was likely intended as a tribute to God, a symbol of thanksgiving or remembrance, gradually transforms into something else entirely. The ephod, once neutral, becomes a snare. It shifts from symbol to substitute, drawing hearts away from the presence of God and toward the relic itself. This is how idolatry often begins, not with rebellion, but with reverence misplaced. Gideon does not lead Israel into worship of Baal again, nor does he publicly deny the God who brought them victory. But he permits, perhaps even unintentionally encourages, a subtle reorientation of devotion. The people begin to revere what was made rather than who made the victory possible. The ephod, though silent, speaks loudly in the hearts of those who gaze upon it. It offers a tangible reminder of success, a relic of glory, a visible connection to a moment of divine power. But without direction, it becomes a vacuum of worship, filling the space where God alone was meant to dwell. The tragedy of this chapter is not just that Gideon allowed the ephod to exist, but that he failed to foresee the consequences of a legacy built without continual humility. His leadership had been forged in the fires of obedience, but in the aftermath of success, vigilance waned. This is the quiet before the fall, not a collapse marked by scandal or violence, but a slow erosion of purpose, a drift from clarity and a settling into comfort. Gideon had once torn down idols with trembling courage. Now he unknowingly built a new one, clothed not in rebellion, but in golden good intentions. What makes this all the more sobering is that Gideon lived out the rest of his days in relative peace. The land had rest for 40 years, a result of his obedience and bravery. He had many sons, a large household, and the visible markers of honor. But the story does not end there. When he died, the people did not continue in faithfulness. They quickly turned again to the Baals, forgetting not only the God who had saved them, but also the man through whom that salvation came. And even while he lived, Gideon had named one of his sons Abimelech, meaning, "My father is king," a subtle contradiction to his earlier refusal of kingship, revealing perhaps that the seed of monarchy had not entirely been uprooted from his own heart. This contrast between Gideon's declaration and his actions reveals the fragile nature of spiritual leadership. It shows how easily the line between faith and legacy can blur, especially when good intentions are not continually submitted to the authority of God. It is not enough to begin well. It is not enough to fight bravely or to deliver nations. Without consistent humility, without ongoing alignment to the original mission, even heroes can lose sight of the very call that once defined them. This portion of Gideon's life is a warning, but not one meant to inspire fear. It is a call to vigilance. It reminds us that past faithfulness, while meaningful, is not a guarantee of future integrity. It underscores that success is not the finish line. In fact, success often marks the beginning of the greater challenge, staying true to the purpose when the threat is no longer obvious. When the enemies are no longer at the gates, when the pressure subsides, when peace settles in, the battle shifts inward. Many today face the same quiet battle. After the storm, when stability is restored, the temptation is not to rebel, but to relax, to hold on to the symbols of former victories, to elevate results over relationship, to protect a reputation rather than pursue renewal. And just like the ephod, even the most well-meaning decisions can lead to distraction if they are not anchored in ongoing dependence on God. The lesson is not to avoid creating, but to ensure that what we create never replaces the Creator. Gideon's life, when viewed in full, teaches that legacy is not only shaped by what we conquer, but by what we allow to remain. And in the space between victory and complacency, there must be a resolve to continually return to the voice that first called us. That voice did not stop speaking after the battle. It still beckoned, still guided, still offered clarity, but the noise of admiration, the comfort of rest, and the allure of influence can all drown out what was once so clear. To remain grounded, especially after success, requires the same posture that began the journey: dependence, surrender, and a heart that remembers where the power came from in the first place. When Gideon was hiding in the winepress, he had no illusions of grandeur. He listened, he obeyed, and because of that posture, God moved. The challenge is to preserve that posture even when the victory is already in hand. Because the mission is not simply to win, it is to remain faithful. And without that, even the greatest victories can quietly give way to defeat. There comes a moment in every life that mirrors Gideon's midnight stand, a moment where the odds are staggering, the fear is real, and the resources seem insufficient. A moment when you look at what you have and feel the weight of everything you don't. This is your 300 moment, the place where faith is not a theory, but a necessity. It's where every excuse is stripped away, where the comfort of the crowd disappears, and where your next step is defined not by how strong you feel, but by how much you trust the one who called you. You don't need an army. You don't need approval. You don't need to have every answer, and you certainly don't need to be fearless. What you need is what Gideon discovered in that quiet place before the trumpet sounded, a resolve to say yes to God when nothing around you makes sense. This story is not just about a man who beat impossible odds. It is about a God who delights in using the unexpected to accomplish the unimaginable. And that same God is not finished writing stories like Gideon's. Your altar moment may not involve tearing down physical idols, but perhaps it means confronting lies you've believed for years. Lies about your worth, your future, your limitations. Maybe it means leaving behind familiar compromises or letting go of something that has taken the place only God should occupy in your heart. Your river test may not involve how you drink water, but it may require you to walk away from safety, from excess, from overdependence on what feels secure. And when your numbers shrink, when the people you thought would walk with you disappear, when the resources dwindle, when the door you counted on closes, remember this: God does his best work with what the world considers not enough. He does not need a crowd to confirm your calling. He does not require ideal conditions to display his power. All he needs is your obedience, your courage to act on his word, and your faith that refuses to be dictated by visible odds. You are not just facing a trial, you are being prepared for a testimony. Your 300 moment is not the end, it is the turning point. And it holds the potential to redefine not only your life, but the lives of those watching you. Because when God moves through the few, the weak, the overlooked, he silences the boast of the strong and leaves no doubt about where the glory belongs. So, if you find yourself surrounded, outnumbered, or overwhelmed, do not retreat. Do not underestimate what God can do with your yes. You're closer to your breakthrough than it feels. The jar may still be unbroken, the torch still hidden, but the moment is coming when light will break forth, confusion will scatter the enemy, and victory will be declared. Not by might, not by power, but by the Spirit of the living God, working through your obedience. Stay faithful, stay expectant. Your 300 moment is not a curse, it is a calling. And you, just like Gideon, were never meant to fight alone. You were meant to walk with the God who sees you not as you are, but as you are becoming. A warrior, a leader, a vessel of deliverance. If this message spoke to you, encouraged you, or helped you see your own battle in a new light, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another video. Click the like button to let others know this content matters. Share your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear your story, your 300 moment, your journey of faith. And please, share this video with someone you care about. You never know who might be standing in the middle of their own impossible, needing a reminder that with God, victory is never out of reach.